Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. Again, as we promised before that 2-minute break that we took, we're going to be keeping it there in Texas, talking about another major headline. You might remember this story. It happened back in 2019, devastating, when the gunman, he killed 23 people in a racist attack at a Texas Walmart. We do know that, according to the Associated Press, he attacked Hispanic shoppers there at a Walmart near the U.S.-Mexico border back in 2019, and new information is coming out about his case. It has now been put on the table, a plea deal underneath this offer that was announced today. He would avoid the death penalty under the law. This is abruptly ending years of efforts by prosecutors to see that he face execution by lethal injection. El Paso County District Attorney James Montoya said during a news conference that this decision there and the prosecution of this gunman who drove across the state for one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history and posted racist messages before opening fire was driven by a majority of victims' relatives who wanted to see this case go behind him. To talk more about this update and where the case is now heading, I want to bring into the conversation Texas-based attorney Trey Gober. Trey, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Again, this is a story that rocked so many people's world when it happened back in 2019, and we've been continuing to follow it as we're getting these updates. What were first your thoughts on that plea deal being put on the table? Is this customary in a case that involves the murder and a mass shooting of so many people, again, also leaving 22 others injured as well?
Well, I think my thoughts are the same as the thoughts of many of us. Disappointment. A lot of us wanted to see the ultimate penalty for the ultimate crime. Can't think of many crimes much worse than this. And certainly, if the death penalty is ever appropriate, it should be inappropriate in a case like this. That's certainly the thoughts that first hit me. But at the same time, when you look at this district attorney's reasoning behind it and the fact that the district attorney is taking into consideration the wishes of the families to get this put behind them so that they can have closure, absolutely, it's something we can support. At the end of the day, the law requires and allows for prosecutorial discretion to take into account a variety of considerations, and certainly consideration and deference to the wishes of the majority of the victims' families should be considered.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. I want to read out just a little bit more about what the plea deal that is currently on the table. We know that a hearing is set for April 21st, but they're now saying that this gunman, he would plead guilty to capital murder and receive life in prison with no possibility of parole. So when you're talking about some of the things that happen in a case like this, again, with a plea deal now being presented, put out on the table, it's not the death penalty, but it is life without the possibility of parole. He's already been convicted in other charges as well. Do you feel like this is what the family wants ultimately, to put this case behind them, find peace? And it's just interesting that this is a mass shooting case. We typically do see the death penalty pursued in these types.
Absolutely. And so I think it's important to note that the victims' families are not a monolith. Certainly, for every victim, there's a number of family members, and there's going to be a difference of opinion among those family members. My understanding from reporting from the district attorney is that the gross majority of support of the victim families support having closure and resolution with this plea deal. I can't think of a punishment worse for this individual for any individual than to know that every morning for the rest of their life, they're going to lock up incarcerated and have no opportunity for release. This person already has, I believe, 90 consecutive life sentences. And so it certainly will be a punishment for this individual to not have the freedom of death to escape waking up in prison every single day.
Trey, I'm glad you brought that up. He has been convicted. He's already been convicted and pleaded guilty to 90 consecutive life sentences. How will this next conviction, if this is what is presented, this plea deal he accepted, how will that affect his time in prison? Will it affect it at all, being that he's already has all this other time that's on the table?
Uh, no, it shouldn't have much of an effect in terms of certainly it won't have an effect on the length of his imprisonment. It'll be an additional set of convictions from state level versus just a federal level. So there's further insulation. You have convictions from dual sovereigns. And it gives closure to these families. Certainly the families have waited long enough since 2019. Reporting is that with delays that we have in our court systems here in Texas, in large part caused by COVID, that this individual wasn't going to see trial in Texas until 2028, which is remarkably long. The reality is we have limited resources for judicial court time for trials, limited resources for prosecutors, limited resources for investigators. And so while this individual will ultimately receive the punishment that the families wish for, uh, that means that these government entities, the courts, the prosecutors, the investigators can also now focus on other crimes and help bring resolution to other victims.
Let's talk about politics because is with everything, it does play a slight role. And this is interesting because even when we're covering other cases, like in California, the Menendez brothers, that's been a very hot and button issue, and certain things and politics does get brought into it as well. Do you think that that impacted this decision in any way for this plea deal to be brought for the death penalty to not be pursued?
I don't think so. And in fact, the current prosecutor, the current district attorney who has made the decision after consulting with families to make this plea offer is a Democrat elected and brought into office in January. His predecessor was a Republican. And that predecessor, the Republican predecessor, came out in support of the decision, acknowledged this is a very tough decision. There's not a decision that's going to make everybody happy, but it is a decision that has to be made. We have to give deference. We have prosecutorial discretion. And certainly, we could always criticize the decision to go forward with the death penalty or to offer the plea deal. But at the end of the day, I don't think that there was a lot of politics in play here. I think this was a decision by the prosecutor to do right by those victims most directly affected, the families of the people who died.
And Trey, of course, we know 23 victims, 22 others injured. Let's talk about civil cases. Are there any on the table that they can now pursue as well as they're putting the criminal portion of this case behind? I mean, this happened at a Walmart. Is Walmart even in the conversation to be sued? Is that even a possibility for families to get some sort of financial compensation from them? Or is it just them going after, again, this now gunman who's been convicted?
This decision by prosecutors to offer life sentence instead of the death penalty will have no effect on any civil claims in Texas. We have a 2-year statute of limitations to bring these claims by the surviving victims and by the families of the victims who were killed. Those lawsuits are long underway or resolved at this point. As far as claims against Walmart or any premise owner, there's a possibility of a claim for inadequate security if the premise owner was aware of a prior threat to people on the property, to their customers, for example. That might be difficult in this case since the gunman drove, I believe it was 700 miles to get to this particular area. There's also questions of who motivated this individual. Where there people or talking pundits that motivated these racist ideologies within this individual, and could those people be held accountable? Certainly, we give a lot of deference to First Amendment free speech, and so there's probably a lot of protection there. I'm not aware of any pending civil litigation, and certainly there should not be any effect with this plea offer on any potential or pending civil cases.
Certainly makes sense. And we again know that this plea hearing and sentencing is set for April 21st. The families are going to be able to give victim impact statements during that portion as well. What else do you expect to come out of that hearing as a whole? What should we be looking for in the next month?
Resolution, frankly. I think that everybody has a date to look forward to. In preparation for coming on here tonight, I reached out and heard from a friend with lots of family and connections in El Paso, and I think he said it best. They can't wait for this person whose name I'm intentionally not saying, the killer, to become irrelevant, so we don't have to think and deal with him anymore. And so I think that having this date set off about a month from now gives families and victims, surviving victims, time to prepare for closure, and we can put this behind us and move forward.
All right. Again, attorney Trey Gober there, Texas-based attorney, here to help us break down the very latest as it pertains to this El Paso mass shooting and that plea deal being put on the table. We'll continue to wait and look for that number, that date. April 21st is when we'll be able to put this behind us. We appreciate you for joining us here on Live Now.
Thank you.